In the popular imagination, the Cold War was a struggle between two totalizing systems, capitalism and communism. The Soviet Union and its allies confronted the United States all over the globe. Proxy wars occurred nearly everywhere, from Cuba and Nicaragua to Vietnam and Cambodia, but the two superpowers never directly fought one another. This was due in part to the deadly weapons each possessed, thermonuclear bombs capable of wiping the entire world out of existence. The US and the Soviet Union nearly came to blows during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, when Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev began constructing ICBM missiles in newly communist Cuba, where Fidel Castro and his subordinate, Che Guevara, had seized power a few years earlier. Cooler heads prevailed, and the fact that both powers might destroy one another ironically became a stabilizing force. This came to be known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD, and while the nuclear arms race seemed to spiral out of control during the 1960s, arms control agreements from the 70s onward reduced much of the tension. A period of détente followed, and despite occasional bouts of saber-rattling during the early 1980s, all parties feared the potential danger wrought by nuclear war. But while the Cold War appeared to divide the world into two armed camps, neither side was exactly a monolith. France left NATO during the 1960s. The country's president, Charles de Gaulle, deeply resented what he saw as the American domination of Western Europe. Britain refused to back the US during the Vietnam War as well. Lyndon Johnson pleaded with the British Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, for troops, at one point telling Wilson that he didn't care if he sent 5 guys and a bagpiper, just so long as the optics of the Western alliance remained. But while divisions between the Western allies were very real, they paled in comparison to divisions within the communist camp. Most damaging was the Sino-Soviet split during the late 1960s, when China and the Soviet Union nearly went to war. Mao Zedong, the Chinese communist leader, had grown wary of the Soviets from the late 1950s onward, believing them to be too slow in promoting world revolution. For their part, Soviet leaders like Nikita Khrushchev blanched at the enormous destruction wrought by Chinese projects like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, which left tens of millions dead. Both powers began openly criticizing one another, and in 1969, Soviet and Chinese troops fired on each other near the Amur River. Though cooler heads here too prevailed, the fiction of worldwide revolutionary comradeship was at an end. American policymakers were slow to recognize the significance of this split. The Johnson administration was wedded to a monolithic vision of communism, in particular the domino theory, whereby one nation falling to communism would result in the triumph of world revolution everywhere. This was why the US fought the Vietnam War, but the domino theory also contributed to other Cold War interventions, where the US overthrew governments in Guatemala, Iran, Chile, and elsewhere when they threatened to be sliding toward communist policy. But the failure to win the war in Vietnam forced a strategic rethink of US priorities. Richard Nixon's Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, was less wedded to the idea of the Cold War as an ideological conflict, preferring instead to interpret it as a great power rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union. And since, in all great power rivalries, the enemy of your enemy is your friend, Kissinger proposed a rapprochement with China against the Soviet Union. Nixon was intrigued, and in 1972 he traveled to China for a summit with Chairman Mao. This thawing of relations had a major impact on the Soviet Union, which found itself increasingly isolated as the 1970s wore on. Perhaps most importantly, by the end of the decade, the glaring flaws in communist ideology were becoming apparent. Soviet central planning had been held together by faith in the revolution, the creation of a new Soviet man, and by terror. Failure to fulfill one's production quota could result, under Stalin at least, in execution or deportation to a gulag. But while central planning could build heavy industry and construct military equipment, it was less able to produce consumer products like TVs, fashion items, and so on, since it had no way of predicting consumer demand. And when the Soviets invested billions in an ill-devised agricultural project in Central Asia, driven by the idea that grain could grow in arid soil if only revolutionary peasants had the will to grow it. The resulting collapse in Soviet agriculture led to bread lines in Soviet cities. Shortages became a fact of life, and since everything was centrally directed, every dollar spent on the military was a dollar not spent on relieving civilian demand. A thriving black market developed alongside the official economy, driven not least by the participation of the Soviet elite. Many within the Politburo lost faith in the Marxist project, though they of course recognized that their own political and economic clout depended upon it. So by the early 1980s, an aging elite governed the Soviet Union in their own immediate interest. They were unwilling to reform, even as they recognized that the Soviet bloc was held together by force. At the height of the Cold War, reform movements in the Eastern Bloc were routinely suppressed by the Red Army. Demonstrations in East Germany in 1953, an outright rebellion in Hungary in 1956, and the mostly peaceful Czech Spring of 1968 were crushed by Soviet tanks. But by the early 1980s, resistance was growing too strong for such repression, especially in Poland, where a workers' movement led by Lech Walesa challenged the communist regime. Walesa's movement, known to the world as Solidarity, was based in the country's factories, and as a worker-driven movement, challenged communism's pretensions to represent the international working class. And in the Soviet Union itself, a younger generation of reformers gradually emerged that sought to challenge the prevailing way of doing things, perhaps saving communism from itself by liberalizing it and introducing a rudimentary market. Mikhail Gorbachev was among these reformers, and he sought to transform the country upon becoming premier in 1985. Horrified by the nuclear meltdown the following year at Chernobyl, Gorbachev sought to encourage internal criticism of Soviet officials, who hitherto had no reason to respond to popular pressure. This meant greater freedom of speech and of the press, a policy that came to be known as glasnost, or openness. And to revitalize the economy, Gorbachev allowed for the creation of a limited capitalist market, a reform he called perestroika. But events rapidly spun out of his control. Inspired by this new spirit of glasnost, critics of the regime began attacking the whole edifice of communism itself, not just corrupt officials. And the success of perestroika, later symbolized in pop culture by the opening of the first McDonald's in the Soviet Union, demonstrated the failures of central planning. Above all, it was Gorbachev's decision to lighten the Soviet grip on Eastern Europe that caused communism to fall. He made clear that Soviet troops would not intervene should there be another Czech Spring, and when East and West Germans began tearing down the Berlin Wall, perhaps the most potent symbol of the Iron Curtain, Gorbachev refused the East German leader Erich Honecker's pleas for assistance. Communist governments fell one after another in Eastern Europe, a transition that almost everywhere but Romania was peaceful. In Romania, the dictator Nicolae Ceausescu sought to cling to power by firing on demonstrators, but he rapidly lost control of events and his life. As the Soviet Union lost control of its client states, demands for change became increasingly hard to ignore within the USSR itself, which after all was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The constituent republics began agitating for their own independence, with the Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania leading the way. As the Soviet Union crumbled in 1991, a clique of old-school army officers launched an attempted coup to drive Gorbachev out of power and restore order. They put Gorbachev under house arrest and ordered tanks into central Moscow. Popular resistance swelled, led above all by the Russian politician Boris Yeltsin, who demanded an end to communism and the recreation of a distinctly Russian state. The generals behind the coup lost their nerve, finding themselves unable to open fire on the demonstrators. But Gorbachev was finished. In December 1991, he resigned and dissolved the Soviet Union. In its place emerged 15 independent states, among them Russia itself. Many looked forward to a new era of freedom and democracy, but as we all now know, such an era would not come to pass. Not all communist regimes fell in the years on either side of 1990. Castro's government in Cuba held on, as did communist regimes in Vietnam and North Korea. In China, the Communist Party still governs, though China has long since ceased to resemble a Marxist-Leninist Maoist state. Mao's successor, Deng Xiaoping, introduced market reforms to China, creating a kind of authoritarian capitalist model that resembled neither the United States nor Maoist-era China. It brought a tremendous amount of prosperity to the country, though political freedoms did not follow, contrary to the expectation of many in the West. In 1989, inspired by the revolution sweeping Eastern Europe, thousands of Chinese students crowded into Tiananmen Square in central Beijing, where they demanded the political freedoms long denied them. But the Chinese government responded in force, making clear that it would not tolerate any threat to the supremacy of the Communist Party, even though it was communist in name only.